morning again. Thinking. We're going to look this morning at the important topic of thinking. You know, I mentioned earlier that you all agreed with me that we have a work to do here on this earth, and I believe part of finishing the work of the Lord is to have strong minds, because the end time battle is a battle over who has control over your mind. Who has control over your mind? I want to approach this from two perspectives this morning. We're going to look at both a Christian and a scientific perspective. But let me start with a story. I was doing some assistant work in a school some time ago, and was asked to help a fifth grader with her math. I was actually checking her off on a list of problems that she should have already known the answer to. So I expected this to be fairly easy. And I started looking at what she had, and she came to a problem she didn't know the answer to. And I said, okay, I can help you with that. I said, what don't you understand? I don't know. Sound familiar? We have a teacher here. I don't know, she said. Well, I was like, well, okay, that's a problem. If you don't know what you don't understand, you're not going to solve this problem very well. I said, all right, let's break this down a little. I said, what's your goal? What's the object here that you're trying to accomplish in this problem? Well, I don't know. Okay. I said, all right, this is a math problem. What's it asking you for? And I'm expecting she's going to be telling me this is addition, this is subtraction, something like that. She goes, well, the answer? I knew that much already. And I realized she didn't understand anything about what she was supposed to be solving. So I began to break it down for her, ask her these simple step-by-step problems, and eventually she gets it. She gets the answer, she writes it down, she moves on, and I know if she were to meet that problem again with different numbers, she would not be able to solve it. Why? She didn't understand the concept. She didn't understand the principle behind what she was supposed to be learning. And this may seem to be a rather extreme case, and you may be thinking, oh, that's just public school or something. This was actually a private school, a charter school, one of the best in the state that I was working with. And here was a student who couldn't even think for themselves. They couldn't even process outside of just, oh, here's A and B, and I'll write the answer down. And you may be thinking, oh, that's an isolated situation. It's not. It is very, very common. This is one of my first experiences to such things, but I quickly realized that this was a very common problem in most educational systems, that we simply had kids that couldn't think. In fact, I would hear teachers complain about it. They would say, my kids can't think. And I would tell them, no, you just need to motivate them better. But as I started seeing it for myself, I said, no. We actually have a problem, a legitimate problem, a lack of thinking skills. But really, you don't have to be a teacher or visit a classroom to see that this is a problem today, right? I mean, you can just think for yourself, if you can think, and realize that this is an issue in society. We look at the behavior of people, and we scratch our heads and go, what in the world are they thinking? Well, maybe they're not. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we don't have any thinkers left. In fact, a recent study found that more than 80% of employers said recent graduates were deficient in applied skills like communication, work ethic, and critical thinking. 80%. That's staggeringly low. This is a problem. Well, psychologists tell us that less than half of us are even capable of what's known as formal reasoning. But while less than half of us might be capable of it, and that's pretty bad, 50%, less than half of us might be capable, but only 5% of us ever use it. Okay, how many here are thinkers? Raise your hand. That's too many. I hope there's more than 5% here. But we are at an all-time low in thinking skills. I mean, this is just a few statistics showing that we've got a serious issue going on here. But I say it's a serious issue, and perhaps we should ask the question, though, is it a serious issue? Is this something that we need to be concerned about? And this is where I want to approach this from a Christian perspective, first of all, and understand why this is critical for us from a spiritual perspective. Is it okay that we're at 5% of us ever thinking? You know, is this just a new trend in society and okay, we'll move on? Or is this a major issue? Is this something we need to be really concerned about? I believe it is something we need to be concerned about. The book Gospel Workers reads, moral purity depends on right thinking. Do we want our young people to grow up morally pure? Well, of course, right? And it depends on what? Right thinking. We could stop right here and just say, wow, thinking must be important. If moral purity depends on it, this is a critical issue. But it doesn't stop there. We read in Christian leadership that young men must be trained up to be thinkers. So moral purity depends on it, and it should be a part of the educational process. Not only that, but God calls upon everyone with whom He works to do the very highest kind of thinking. Okay, so moral purity depends on it. That's pretty important. It should be part of the educational process, and God calls upon everyone, you and I, if we're to work with Him, to be good thinkers. Sounding very important to me. God has given men talents, which He means they should use. He has given them minds. Why did He give us minds? To fill up space between our ears? No, He gave us a mind to use it, right? He means they should become thinkers and do their own thinking and planning rather than depend upon others to think and plan for them. And that's the key. We are spending far too much time depending on somebody else to do our thinking for us as a society in general. One of my favorite quotes really drives this point home. From the book Education, page 17, every human being, are we all humans here? Yes. Okay, this applies to every single one of us. Created in the image of God, is endowed with a power akin to that of the Creator. All right, somebody give me a definition. This word akin, we don't use this very much in these days, a bit of an old English term. What does this mean, akin? Like, exactly. So it's we've been given something that's like God Himself, like our Creator. What is this thing we've been given that's like our Creator? Here it is. Individuality, power to think and to do. And so now we start to have a definition of the type of thinking we're talking about this morning. Because when we talk about thinking skills, you might be imagining Socrates and Plato and their philosophies. Is that good thinking? Well, it's thinking, but that's not the type of thinking we're discussing this morning. Or you might be thinking of a PhD, somebody with a PhD. Now, don't take me critical here. I'm not trying to insult any PhDs, but I've met plenty of PhDs who were not good thinkers. That's not the type of thinking we're discussing this morning. That's no guarantee of a good thinker. What's the type of thinking? The key lays in this word, individuality. It's the power of individual thought that God has given us that is unique, should be unique in us from others. Individual thought. It's that ability to think for yourself, to reason for yourself, to arrive at your beliefs and conclusions independent of somebody else telling you how you're supposed to believe and think. It's that ability to think for yourself, to base your beliefs on the Word of God and stand for them though the heavens fall. It's that ability to stand for your beliefs no matter what the media says, no matter what your peers say, no matter what everybody else does. When we come to the end of this earth's history, the entire world will be thinking differently than we do. And it will take individual thinkers that know their beliefs and can stand for it. The men in whom this power is developed are the men who bear responsibilities, who are leaders in enterprise and who influence character. We need leaders. We need those who can bear responsibility, and we need those who can influence instead of being influenced. And we have a society in general that is merely being influenced. It is the work of true education to develop this power, to train the youth to be thinkers. And read it with me, and not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. When I read that, I said, that's exactly what the problem is. That's what I'm seeing in the classroom. We have an educational system that's programming our kids to remember something long enough to put it down on a test. Rather than, all that's doing is reflecting somebody else's thoughts, right? You're just studying what somebody else has said and remembering it for a while. That's not true education. True education teaches you to be a thinker and not depending on someone else's thoughts. In times of discouragement and darkness, will we soon have times of discouragement and darkness? Well, you told me earlier you thought Jesus was coming soon, and I'm pretty sure we know that times of discouragement and darkness will come before that. So how important to have calm, and what kind of men? thinking men, who are not dependent on circumstances, but who trust God and labor on in the darkness as well as the light. You see, a lack of good thinking abilities goes far beyond the practical day-to-day decisions. Important for that, yes, but goes beyond that. It goes beyond our ability to work for the Lord. It goes right to the heart of personal spiritual success. Personal spiritual success. Why? Because the end-time battle is a battle over who has control over your mind. Who has control over your mind? Let's read a couple of verses that will illustrate this to us very well. Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. Chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. I have a volunteer that would like to read this. Maybe one of our children or young people. Someone like to read Revelation 7, 2 and 3? Anyone? Don't be shy. All right, go ahead.
And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads.
Excellent, thank you. Now let me test your reading comprehension. Was this the seal of God or Satan being spoken of here? Seal of God, excellent. Where was it placed? On their foreheads. What an interesting location. What do you think the forehead represents? Our thinking, our mind. This isn't a rubber stamp placed on the skin of your forehead. You realize that, right? This is symbolic, representing the seal of God placed upon your mind. But specifically, it's not placed on the back of your head. It's placed on the front. What does the front part of your brain deal with? The frontal lobe. Your brain area, the frontal lobe, that controls your ability to make decisions. It's that area of individual thought. And God says, I want to place my seal upon the area of your brain that makes your spiritual decisions. But is God the only one that wants to place a seal on our minds? He is not. Turn over to Revelation 14, verse 9. I'll take another volunteer for this one. Revelation 14 and verse 9. Revelation 14, 9. Go ahead. Excellent. Okay, here's another test. Is this the seal of God or the seal of Satan being talked about here? Of Satan. Excellent. So we were just talking about the seal of God. And God says, I want to place my seal upon your forehead. And now here comes the mark of the beast, Satan's seal. And where did he say he wants to put it? Same exact place, the forehead or the hand. Notice, God says, I want control of your actions through your mind. Satan says, I'll take the mind or the actions. I don't care how I get them. But both of them go for the mind first. The end time battle is a battle over who has control over your mind. We see this all throughout Scripture, this idea of thinking. In our Scripture reading this morning, Paul tells us, be not conformed. Now, when the Bible says don't do something, what is Satan going to do? He wants you to do it. So if God says, don't be conformed to this world, Satan's going to say, be conformed to this world. And God says, don't be conformed to this world, but how do we avoid that? By the renewing of your mind, transformed minds. And so Satan will say, I want you to be conformed, so don't have a transformed mind. In 1 Peter 1:13, I believe it is, Peter says, gird up the loins of your mind. Speaking of the end times, strengthening your mind. What did you do in ancient times when you were girding up? What were you getting ready to do? Battle. You were going to fight. To fight the end time battle, we need strong minds, because the end time battle is a battle over who has control over your mind. We read that the warfare in which we are engaged is largely mental. We are not fighting a battle with physical powers. We are fighting a battle over the mind. God knows that our young people, this is in the book Messages to Young People, God knows that our young people will have to battle against the powers of darkness that strive to gain control of the human mind. The devil is out to gain control of our minds. Question is, does he wait until a person reaches, say, 18 and is like, all right, I've given the parents 18 years head start, now it's my turn? Is that how Satan works? No. He starts as early as possible, right? He starts with that infant in the mother's arms. And listen to this. I saw standing by the side of these neglected children the one who was cast out of the heavenly courts because he originated sin. He, the enemy of souls, was watching for opportunities to gain control of the mind of every child whose parents had not given faithful instruction in regard to Satan's snares. We are fighting a battle. And we are fighting a battle over who has control over our minds and who has control over our children's minds. It was the historian Carter G. Woodson who said, when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. You think Satan knows this? He does. He says, I'll go for the thinking. I'll go for the mind. I'll place my seal upon the forehead. And once I've got that, I don't have to worry about the actions because I've got the whole human being. It was a famous leader who once said, how fortunate for leaders that men do not think. Ponder that one. How fortunate for leaders that men do not think. Who do you think it was who said that? No, it wasn't Donald Trump. It was Adolf Hitler. I refuse to get into politics this morning, but let's just say that this is indicative, and this is exactly what's going on, and we know will happen even more in the last days when we cease to think. We've lost the battle. It is the special work of Satan in these last days to take possession of the minds of youth. This is a spiritual issue. Have I made this clear enough? Do we know this is a spiritual battle we're fighting? Have we recognized the importance of thinking skills? Yes or no? Yes. Okay, excellent. Now I want to take a shift, because it's one thing to say, yeah, the devil is attacking our thinking and that's his goal, and it's quite another to realize how he's doing it, because we have to realize what he's going to do. Now, I'm sure there are many things that we could come up with, but I want to touch on a few this morning of how he is damaging thinking abilities. And I want to focus in on his attacks on childhood, because, again, he has the most success when he starts young. And so he's going to work from the earliest years. Now, just because the research and the material that I have here pertains to early childhood doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to us, too. We can all take lessons from this in our own lives. But let's look at some practical ways in which the devil is attacking the minds of our children. Let's start, though, first of all, with this quotation. Close reasoners and logical thinkers are few. We've seen that already, right? 20%, 5%, whatever statistic you want to use, it's few. Why? For the reason that false influences have checked the development of the intellect. This word checked, here's another Old English word that we don't use in this context very much. Somebody want to define this for me?
Slow down. Insured?
Insured? Not quite. In this context, that could be a definition of that word, but not in this context. What was it? Hindered, yes, hindered. It's held it back. That's the Old English term for checked there. Actually, it's interesting. My grandpa is a dog trainer. And he uses something called a check lead, which is a short little leash he clips on the dog and he checks it. He holds it back. So they're still sort of using that Old English term there. So essentially, what this is telling us, and research backs this up well, children are born with this innate desire to learn. To discover the world around them, to think. And so they're progressing, they're learning, they're developing, on and on they go, but then something comes in and checks it. It stops it. It holds it back. And so they're wanting to advance, but then it's holding it back. It's pulling it back. Something, false influences checking the development of the intellect. Now, some of Satan's most successful strategies are false educational influences. And I'll get more into that this afternoon. But this morning I want to look at what I've titled Tactics of Satan. 10 tactics of Satan to damage thinking abilities. 10 tactics. First tactic, a lack of physical activity. Now you're saying, hang on a second here. Here we're talking about thinking skills and now you're telling me I need to go exercise? Yeah, absolutely. It is critical to a good function, a well-functioning mind. Research is actually telling us that for young children, physical activity is more important than time spent studying. Not just as important, actually more important. They say literally if you have a block of time and you can either do the homework or go outside, you don't hopefully have time for both, but if you can do one or the other, you're better off going outside because the child will learn better, their mind will develop more. This is in the early years especially. And part of the reason for this is an area of the brain known as the cerebellum. Cerebellum is linked with higher frontal levels in the brain. It's a large area right down behind the brainstem. I believe I'm probably going to get my stats off here. I just saw this a couple of weeks ago. I think it's about 10% of the brain area, but contains 40% of the brain's neurons. So it's a very densely packed area of the brain. And it sends its little neurons out all over the brain and interacts with the rest of the brain almost. In particular, though, those higher frontal levels. Those areas of your brain that help you make decisions are very connected with a well-functioning cerebellum. Cerebellum also deals with the ability to perform repetitive activities automatically. Handwriting is a good example. Music is another. Cognitive skills, language, social interaction, music, and attention. Anyone here use their cerebellum yet this morning? I hope you have. You need to have. It's a very important area of the brain, and again, very linked with those decision-making areas of your brain. So, to me, seeing a list like this, the next question to ask is, well, how do we help develop a good cerebellum? Movement. Movement is absolutely necessary for proper cerebellar development. Activities like rocking for the infant has been shown to help develop the cerebellum. Crawling, very important for toddlers. Not only helps develop the cerebellum, it helps develop the corpus callosum, which is a connection between the hemispheres of the brain. Very important for learning. They've done so many studies on crawling. They found one that children who crawled more ended up with better reading skills later on. Another one, children who crawled more had better handwriting skills. Not because of the brain connection, but because it was strengthening the wrist muscles that helped them handwrite, have good handwriting. So many benefits of crawling, but especially for the cerebellum. Spinning, hanging upside down. You wonder why kids love to do these things? An adult can't stand it, you know? It's actually good for their brains. And what we now know is that the semicircular canals of the ear, the fluid in the semicircular canals is very thin and watery in childhood. It doesn't stimulate the vestibular system in quite the same way. Kids actually don't get as dizzy as adults do. And again, I think God just knew that it was good for their brains. Did you have a question? No? Did you have a question? Did you have your hand up? Okay. Yes?
Neither of my children crawled.
Neither of them crawled?
No, they just got up and started walking.
It happens. Yep.
But they both have dyslexia.
Interesting. So she said neither of her children crawled, but they both have dyslexia. That's an interesting connection there. I've actually known parents whose toddlers went right into walking. I knew one parent that actually forced their child to crawl. They would get on top of them, hands over hands, and they would crawl with them just because they knew it was good for the brain. Oh yeah, that's the interesting connection there. Dr. Jane Healy, you're going to see a few quotes from her today. She's one of the eminent educational psychologists of our day. Did you have your hand up? Okay. And some excellent research. I'll be quoting quite a bit from her today. She mentions physical activity here and says that after birth, physical activities are one of the child's main means of advancing physical, intellectual, and emotional growth. Now, we have three main areas of education. We know this. As Christians, we have the physical development, academic development, and spiritual development. She is essentially, from a secular standpoint, naming those three areas: the physical, the intellectual, and the emotional, or EQ, as it's often termed today. So physical activities are one of the main means of advancing those three areas of education, so you should encourage many forms of body movement. Now, there are many ways in which you could go get some physical activity, and there are many good ways to get physical activity. Of course, outdoor is always best. The fresh air, the sunshine, I'll get into more of that this afternoon, why that is so good. But there's one form of outdoor physical activity, it's whole body activity, that is better than all the rest. Anyone want to guess? What is the best form, not the best form of exercise, we know that one's walking, right? But the best form of a whole body activity you could find outside. Any guesses? Gardening. Climbing trees is good too, yeah. Gardening. Gardening is as good as it gets. No line of manual training is of more value than agriculture. There is nothing quite as good as working in the garden. Why? I'll get to that this afternoon. It's incredible the research we've uncovered on why gardening is so good for us. It is not an outdated form of activity. It is now more important to us than ever before. I'll touch on that this afternoon though. Point number 2, overstimulation. Overstimulation can take many different areas. I'm going to focus just in on 3 this morning. We have too many toys and gadgets and stuff in a child's life. That's a form of overstimulation. Too many things to do, too much in the schedule, and media. Media is overstimulating just by default. Let me first touch on the toys though. Research shows that the more toys children have, the more bored they are. The more toys, the more bored. Because there's no need to focus on something for a longer period of time, right? You just, get tired of that, you move on to something else. And you get tired of that, and you move on, you move on, you move on, and pretty soon you don't have that power of attention, and you're bored with life in general because there's nothing holding your attention. The overstimulation has been linked to the stress response in the brain, a danger response where the brain literally feels afraid of its environment, overactivity, frustration, irritability, and superficial thinking. If you notice any of these symptoms in your child, there's a high probability they have an overstimulated lifestyle. The irritability, frustration, overactivity, all those sort of things becoming very common today, and it is linked to simply too much in the child's life. And again, that can take the form of too much stuff. The other area is just too much in the schedule. You got school, and then you got to do your homework, and then you have soccer, and then there's swimming, and then there's music, and then there's dance, and then there's this, and then there's that. And the kids get home, and everybody's just exhausted, and it's actually overstimulating to the mind. Children need some quiet time. And of course, within the schoolroom itself, we see overstimulation because we say, you have to learn this, and now shut off that and go learn something else, and now learn this, and now learn that, and now learn that, and we just pile it on. Every hour, we change subjects. Elizabeth Walling put it well when she said, the bell will ring just when they're engulfed in learning about the solar system to tell them it's time to start learning how to dissect a sentence. A child learns that no subject is truly meaningful or interesting, and therefore learns not to be truly interested in anything meaningful. I'm sure we could all relate to this to some degree or another. It is detrimental to learning because children need that time to think and to explore, to figure out the world around them, to discover what it's like in real life. And as we allow them that exploration time, we can actually boost learning through what's known as incidental learning. Incidental learning are those little opportunities that come up in the everyday life that teach things just as well, if not better, than they would learn out of a textbook. Here's a great example, again from Dr. Healy. Another youngster was busy constructing some mental schemas about number. He lined up 8 blocks in a row and counted them in one direction, then backward to see if they were the same. Then he stacked them up into a tower and counted them again, up and down. Convinced that 8 is 8 from all directions, he skipped off, unaware he had just mastered an abstract mathematical idea. I mean, here was real life learning, right? And so what if the mom or the teacher or whoever was in this environment would have said, time to stop playing, we're going to go learn math. Well, he was learning math, right? I mean, this was everyday learning. This was math just as well as he could, if not better, than he could learn out of a textbook. So this is the benefit of that exploratory learning environment, and it is not as stimulated as the pressured and more structured environment. It was Dr. Raymond Moore, one of the eminent educational researchers of the past century, who said, quietness, calmness, and freedom from artificial excitement build strength in the immature child. And he was only reflecting what we read in the book Child Guidance, that the more quiet and simple the life of the child, the more free from artificial excitement, and the more in harmony with nature, the more favorable it is to physical and mental vigor and spiritual strength. This is those 3 areas of education again, physical, mental, and spiritual. Quiet and simple. And the best place, of course, to get that is in the country. That is the ideal environment for children. Point number 3, too much study. The young people love it when I mention this one. We can definitely have too much study. Is study a good thing? Is study a good thing? Yes, it is. We need good study habits. We need to be able to study, but we can have too much of a good thing. We need a balanced lifestyle. And so too much study has been linked to learned helplessness, where the brain just feels like it can't learn anymore because it's just got too much piled on it. Shutting off, superficial learning, burnout, illnesses, many learning disabilities now linked to simply too much time with the textbooks. We can spend a lot more time on this, but let's just say, we have counsel that we need to be dividing the time between the academic and the spiritual and the physical to cultivate a true educational atmosphere. Point number 4, testing. Now, I know we have one teacher here. Do we have any other teachers in the audience? All right, 2, 3, excellent. So most of you would probably agree with me, especially if you're a teacher, that standardized testing has some significant issues now. It's not really helping kids learn all that much, right? And that gets a lot of criticism, this whole standardized testing environment. I want to take this one step further, though. What gets into us that we have to sort of quantify and qualify and measure kids to the nth degree and then stick a label on them? I mean, is that going to help them learn that much? Not really, and I would actually argue that it is hindering the learning process. Dr. David Elkin comes to us with a PhD in child development from Tufts University. He wrote a great book called The Hurried Child. And he tells us that schools have become increasingly industrialized and product-oriented. Teachers are unionized, textbooks are standardized on a national level, and testing has become mechanized and all-pervasive as a consequence. Education is reforming, which means more basics, more hours, more homework, more testing, more of everything that's creating the problem. It's a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease. Now that to me is pretty interesting because all these things, what he's essentially saying is all these things that are supposed to be helping the learning process are actually hindering it. They're actually the ones causing the problem. He's saying, let's take a step back and consider what is actually creating the problem. And I find it so interesting that, I'll talk more about this afternoon, but many children who end up struggling with the academics, what's the natural response? Just pump up the pressure, right? Well, maybe we need to take a step back and say, what's causing this problem? And I'll look at more in that this afternoon. But let's focus in a bit more on testing. Under these circumstances, children discover very quickly that passing tests rather than meaningful learning is what school is all about. I think to my college years, and I would cram the day before, take the test in the morning, and an hour later I didn't remember anything I put down in that test. Please tell me I'm not the only one here that did that, right? I mean, that's just how it worked. And I got good grades in college, but how did I do that? I had just learned that school was not about learning. It was about taking tests. If I could take that test, I could get my good grades, I could keep my scholarships, and on I would continue. I wasn't really learning. And if we culture that in children from an early age, we are really killing that love of learning. There's no time or space to develop the deep understanding of concepts, to test out new ideas through verbal and written action, or develop deductive reasoning skills. The memorizing necessary for these tests is a linear process that does not require entire brain use. Rote memory is a straight line process requiring none of the depth of understanding that comes from whole brain activation. In short, rote memory does not require thinking. Okay, if we're wanting to encourage thinking skills, this just isn't cutting it. It is not doing the job for us. Now, let me clarify here. There are different types of memorization. We're speaking here of rote memory, which is not requiring thinking. Now, obviously, there are other ways that we memorize things. I get the question about scripture memorization. Now, there are types of rote scripture memorization with no meaning behind it. We should be memorizing with meaning, though. When you learn something and you can tell it to somebody else and you can explain it and you understand it and it means something to you, that's a totally different type of memorization than just remembering something long enough to put it on a test. Doris Fromberg, who's Director of Early Childhood Teacher Education at Hofstra University, tells us that standardized tests are categorizing children. There's no evidence